The dusty streets of Millbrook, Wyoming, stretched endlessly under the scorching summer sun of 1887. Margaret O'Sullivan stepped down from the rickety stagecoach, her worn leather boots hitting the wooden platform with a hollow thud that seemed to echo her own emptiness. At 24, she had traveled over 1,000 miles from Boston, carrying nothing but a small carpet bag and a heart heavy with desperation. The advertisement in the newspaper had promised a new life, a fresh start with a rancher seeking a wife. What it hadn't mentioned was that her future husband would be standing before her now, wiping sweat from his considerable brow with a handkerchief that had seen better days. The journey west had been a nightmare of dust, uncomfortable seats, and the constant fear of what awaited her at the end of the line. Margaret had left Boston not out of adventure, but out of necessity. Her father's gambling debts had consumed the family fortune, leaving her with two choices: accept charity from relatives who had made their disdain clear, or answer the advertisement for a mail-order bride that had appeared in the Boston Herald. The letter from Thomas Brennan had been kind, respectful, and had painted a picture of a prosperous ranch and a man seeking companionship. What it hadn't prepared her for was the reality now standing before her. Thomas Brennan was not what she had expected. The man before her was easily twice her size, his belly straining against a vest that clearly struggled to contain him. His face was round and flushed, with kind eyes that seemed to sparkle despite the harsh judgment she was already forming. Behind her, she could hear the whispered giggles of his three sisters who had come to witness this momentous occasion. Mary, the eldest at 32, stood with her arms crossed, clearly skeptical of this arrangement. Sarah, 28, tried to hide her smirk behind a gloved hand, while young Elizabeth, barely 20, made no effort to conceal her amusement. The sisters had been living at the ranch since their parents' death 5 years earlier, and they had grown protective of Thomas, perhaps overly so. They had watched him pour his heart into letters to potential brides, only to be rejected time and again by women who found excuses to break their agreements once they learned more about him. This latest arrangement had filled them with both hope and dread. Hope that their beloved brother might finally find happiness, and dread that he would face yet another crushing disappointment. Before you continue with this incredible story, I'd love for you to subscribe to our channel and let me know in the comments what city you're watching from. Your support means the world to us, and I'm excited to share the rest of Margaret's journey with you. Margaret's first words to her intended husband would haunt her for weeks to come. Looking him up and down with undisguised disgust, she declared loud enough for his sisters and half the town to hear, "He's fat and a pig!" The words hung in the air like smoke from a gunshot, and she watched as Thomas's face crumpled slightly before he quickly composed himself. His sisters gasped in unison, Mary stepping forward as if to defend her brother, but Thomas raised a gentle hand to stop her. "I reckon I understand your disappointment, Miss O'Sullivan," he said quietly, his voice carrying a warmth that surprised her. "The journey's been long, and I'm sure I'm not what you pictured. Perhaps we should get you settled, and we can talk properly once you've had some rest." His response was so measured, so kind, despite her cruelty, that Margaret felt the first stirring of something she couldn't quite name. Shame, perhaps, or the beginning of curiosity about this man who absorbed insults like a sponge absorbs water. The townspeople who had gathered to witness the arrival of Thomas's bride began to murmur among themselves. Some shook their heads in disapproval at Margaret's harsh words, while others whispered that perhaps Thomas was finally getting what he deserved for thinking he could buy a wife. The local pastor, Reverend Williams, stepped forward with a diplomatic smile, suggesting that perhaps everyone should allow the couple some privacy to get acquainted. But the damage was done, and Margaret could see in Thomas's eyes that her words had cut deeper than any physical wound ever could. The Brennan Ranch sprawled across 3,000 acres of prime Wyoming territory, with cattle dotting the landscape like scattered coins. Thomas had built it from nothing after the war, working 18-hour days to create something lasting, something worthy of the family he hoped to have. The main house was modest but well built, with a wraparound porch that caught the evening breeze and windows that let in the morning light. As they rode toward it in his wagon, Margaret noticed how gently he handled the horses, how he spoke to them in low, soothing tones that seemed to calm even the most skittish mare. The ranch buildings told a story of careful planning and hard work. The barn was spacious and well-maintained, with stalls that were cleaned daily and hay lofts that were always full. The bunkhouse where the ranch hands lived was simple but comfortable, with a large common room where the men gathered in the evenings to play cards and share stories. There was a smokehouse for preserving meat, a root cellar for storing vegetables, and a workshop where Thomas crafted furniture and repaired equipment with his own hands. "I know this isn't what you expected," Thomas said as they approached the house, his voice barely audible over the creaking of the wagon wheels. "But I want you to know that you're safe here. Whatever brought you west, whatever you're running from, it can't touch you on this land." Margaret turned to study his profile, noting the way his jaw was set with determination, the way his hands held the reins with practiced ease. There was strength in this man, she realized, though it wasn't the kind she had been taught to recognize. As they pulled up to the house, Margaret noticed details that spoke to Thomas's character. The porch was swept clean, with rocking chairs positioned to catch the best view of the sunset. Flower boxes under the windows held carefully tended roses and wildflowers, clearly planted by someone who appreciated beauty. A wind chime, made from horseshoes, hung from the porch ceiling, creating a gentle melody in the evening breeze. These were not the touches of a crude rancher, but of a man who understood that a home should nourish the soul as well as the body. That first evening, as Margaret sat at the dinner table with Thomas and his sisters, she began to see glimpses of the man beneath the surface. He served her first, ensuring her plate was full before attending to his own needs. When Mary made a sharp comment about city women not understanding ranch life, Thomas quietly redirected the conversation, protecting Margaret from further embarrassment without making a scene. He asked about her journey, her family, her hopes for the future, and when she gave short, defensive answers, he simply nodded and moved on to safer topics. The meal itself was a revelation. Thomas had prepared it himself, explaining that he enjoyed cooking and found it relaxing after long days working the ranch. The beef was tender and perfectly seasoned, the vegetables fresh from his own garden, the bread still warm from the oven. Margaret, who had expected rough frontier fare, found herself impressed despite her determination to remain aloof. When she complimented the meal, Thomas's face lit up with genuine pleasure, and she caught a glimpse of the boy he must have been before life had taught him to expect disappointment. The conversation during dinner revealed more about Thomas's character than Margaret had expected to learn. He spoke knowledgeably about literature, having taught himself to read during the long winter months. He discussed politics with nuance and intelligence, showing an understanding of national issues that surprised her. When Elizabeth mentioned a problem with her arithmetic studies, Thomas patiently explained the concepts in a way that made them clear, revealing a natural teaching ability that spoke to his patience and intelligence. The days that followed revealed layers of Thomas's character that Margaret had never expected to find. She watched from the kitchen window as he worked with his ranch hands, noting how they respected him, not through fear, but through genuine admiration. When old Pete, the eldest cowboy, injured his back during a cattle drive, Thomas personally rode into town to fetch the doctor, paying for the treatment from his own pocket without hesitation. When the widow Henderson's fence was destroyed in a storm, Thomas and his men spent their Sunday rebuilding it, refusing any payment except a slice of her famous apple pie. Margaret began to understand the rhythm of ranch life and Thomas's place in it. He rose before dawn every day, not because he had to, but because he genuinely cared about every aspect of the operation. She watched him check on sick cattle with the tenderness of a parent caring for a child, saw him spend hours training a young horse with infinite patience, witnessed him settle disputes between his workers with wisdom and fairness that would have impressed a judge. The ranch hands, she learned, were fiercely loyal to Thomas. They told stories around the evening fire of how he had given them jobs when no one else would, how he had advanced them money for family emergencies, how he had stood up to other ranchers who tried to cheat them. These were hard men, weathered by years of difficult work, but they spoke of Thomas with a respect that bordered on reverence. Margaret found herself drawn to these small acts of kindness, these moments when Thomas thought no one was watching. She began to understand that his size, which she had so cruelly mocked, came not from laziness or gluttony, but from a man who worked hard and ate simply, whose body reflected years of physical labor and the comfort of a life well lived. His gentle nature, which she had initially mistaken for weakness, was actually a strength that drew people to him like moths to a flame. One afternoon, while exploring the ranch, Margaret discovered Thomas's private study. The room was lined with books, more than she had expected to find in a frontier home. There were volumes of poetry, philosophy, history, and science, many showing signs of frequent reading. On the desk was a half-finished letter, and though she knew she shouldn't, Margaret couldn't help but glance at it. It was a response to a scientific journal discussing new methods of cattle breeding with an intelligence and expertise that completely contradicted her assumptions about this man. She also found a journal, left open to a page dated just after her arrival. The entry spoke of his hopes for their marriage, his determination to be patient with her adjustment, and his belief that love could grow between them if given time. There was no bitterness about her harsh words, no anger at her rejection, only a quiet determination to prove himself worthy of her affection. Margaret closed the journal quickly, feeling like an intruder, but the words stayed with her. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink, Thomas spoke about his dreams for the ranch, his hopes for the future. "I've always believed that a man's worth isn't measured by his appearance or his words, but by his actions," he said, his voice thoughtful. "I know I'm not much to look at, Margaret, but I promise you this. If you'll have me, I'll spend every day of my life trying to be worthy of you." The sincerity in his voice, the vulnerability he showed in that moment, cracked something open in Margaret's chest that she had kept locked away for years. He told her about his childhood, growing up on a small farm in Missouri with parents who valued education and kindness above all else. His father had been a teacher before becoming a farmer and had instilled in Thomas a love of learning that had sustained him through the loneliest years of building the ranch. His mother had taught him to cook, to sew, to tend a garden, believing that a man should be self-sufficient in all things. They had died in a cholera outbreak when Thomas was 25, leaving him with his 3 sisters and a determination to create a legacy that would honor their memory. The war had taken him away from the farm for 3 years, and he spoke quietly of the horrors he had witnessed, the friends he had lost, the way the experience had taught him to value peace and gentleness above all else. He had returned home to find the farm in ruins and his sisters struggling to survive. The decision to move west had been born of necessity, but the dream of the ranch had sustained them through the difficult early years. As the weeks passed, Margaret began to see Thomas not as the disappointing husband she had been saddled with, but as a man of remarkable depth and character. She watched him comfort a frightened colt with infinite patience, saw him share his lunch with a hungry drifter without question, witnessed him defend her honor when some of the townspeople made unkind remarks about her sharp tongue and city ways. Slowly, inexorably, she found herself falling in love with this gentle giant who had absorbed her cruelest words and responded with nothing but kindness. The transformation in Margaret's feelings didn't happen overnight. It began with small moments of recognition, the way Thomas always ensured she had the most comfortable chair at dinner, how he remembered her preference for tea over coffee, The way he would quietly leave wildflowers on her windowsill without ever taking credit for the gesture. She began to notice how the ranch hand's children ran to him when he came to town, how the local shopkeepers always had time for a conversation with him, how even the most cantankerous horses seemed to calm in his presence. She also began to see how her initial rejection had affected him. Though he never complained or showed bitterness, she noticed the way he sometimes hesitated before speaking to her, the careful distance he maintained, the sadness that would sometimes cloud his eyes when he thought she wasn't looking. The realization that she had wounded this good man filled her with a shame that grew stronger each day. The turning point came during a fierce thunderstorm that threatened to destroy the season's crops. While other ranchers huddled in their homes, Thomas rode out into the tempest to secure loose equipment and check on the animals. Margaret watched from the window, her heart in her throat, as lightning illuminated his massive figure battling against the wind and rain. When he returned, soaked to the bone and exhausted, she was waiting with hot coffee and dry clothes, and for the first time since her arrival, she looked at him with something approaching admiration. The storm had been building all day, with dark clouds gathering on the horizon like an army preparing for battle. Thomas had spent the afternoon securing everything that could be moved. But when the wind began to howl and the rain started falling in sheets, he knew that more needed to be done. Margaret had begged him not to go out, but he had simply kissed her forehead gently and said, "The animals are counting on me." For 2 hours, Margaret paced the house, jumping at every crack of thunder, straining to see through the rain-lashed windows for any sign of Thomas's return. His sisters tried to comfort her, but she could see the worry in their eyes as well. When lightning struck the old oak tree near the barn, sending sparks flying dangerously close to the hay storage, Margaret nearly ran out into the storm herself. "You could have been killed out there," she said, her voice shaking slightly as she helped him out of his wet coat. Thomas looked at her with surprise, noting the concern in her eyes, the way her hands trembled as she touched his arm. "The animals needed tending," he replied simply. "A man doesn't abandon his responsibilities because of a little weather." It was then that Margaret realized she had been the one who was blind, not Thomas. She had been so focused on appearances, so concerned with what others might think, that she had nearly missed the treasure that had been placed right in front of her. As she helped him change into dry clothes, Margaret found herself really looking at Thomas for the first time. Yes, he was a large man, but his size spoke of strength and capability rather than weakness. His hands, which she had once thought clumsy, were actually gentle and skilled, capable of both delicate work and tremendous power. His face, which she had dismissed as plain, was actually kind and intelligent, with eyes that held depths of compassion she was only beginning to understand. That night, as the storm raged outside, Margaret made a decision that would change both their lives forever. She found Thomas sitting by the fire, reading a book of poetry by lamplight, his reading glasses perched on his nose in a way that made him look scholarly and gentle. "Thomas," she said, her voice soft with newfound understanding, "I owe you an apology, not just for my words that first day, but for my blindness since then. I've been looking for a husband who would impress others when what I needed was a man who would cherish me." The book in his hands was a collection of Shakespeare's sonnets, and she could see that he had been reading Sonnet 116, the one about love that bears it out even to the edge of doom. The irony was not lost on her. Here was a man who understood love in its truest form, while she had been chasing shadows and illusions. The confession hung between them like a bridge waiting to be crossed. Thomas set down his book and looked at her with those kind eyes that had seen through her defenses from the very beginning. "Margaret," he said gently, "I fell in love with your spirit the moment you stepped off that stagecoach. Your fire, your strength, even your anger. It all spoke to something in me that had been waiting my whole life. I don't need your apology, but I would treasure your heart if you're willing to give it." He told her then about the loneliness of the past years, The way he had thrown himself into building the ranch, partly to distract himself from the emptiness of his personal life. He spoke of the letters he had written to potential brides, the careful way he had tried to present himself honestly, while still hoping someone might see past his physical shortcomings to the man beneath. He had never lied about his appearance, but he had hoped that his character might be enough to overcome first impressions. In that moment, surrounded by the warmth of the firelight and the sound of rain on the roof, Margaret finally understood what love truly meant. It wasn't about finding someone who looked perfect or impressed the neighbors. It was about finding someone who saw you completely and loved you anyway. Someone who would stand in a storm to protect what mattered. Someone who would absorb your worst moments and respond with grace. She crossed the room and took his large, calloused hands in her smaller ones, feeling the strength and gentleness that had built this ranch. This life, this sanctuary he was offering to share with her. "Yes, Thomas," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "Yes, I'll marry you. Not because I have to, but because I want to. Because I love you." The smile that spread across his face was like sunrise after the longest night, and when he pulled her into his arms, Margaret finally understood that she had found her home. Their first kiss was gentle and tentative, as if Thomas couldn't quite believe this moment was real. Margaret had expected to feel nothing, or at best tolerance, but instead she felt a warmth spreading through her chest that had nothing to do with the fire crackling nearby. When they broke apart, she saw tears in his eyes, and she realized that this strong, capable man had been as vulnerable and hopeful as she had been frightened and defensive. They spent the rest of the night talking, really talking, for the first time since her arrival. Thomas told her about his dreams for expanding the ranch, his hopes of starting a school for the local children, his plans to bring more culture and refinement to their corner of Wyoming. Margaret shared her own dreams, many of which she had thought lost forever when her father's debts destroyed her old life. She spoke of her love of music, her desire to have a garden, her hope of someday having children who would grow up feeling secure and loved. Their wedding took place 3 weeks later in the small church in Millbrook, with the whole town in attendance. Margaret wore her mother's dress, altered to fit her smaller frame, and Thomas wore his best suit, which his sisters had secretly taken in to better flatter his figure. As they exchanged vows, Margaret looked into his eyes and saw her future reflected there. Years of laughter and hard work, children playing in the yard, quiet evenings on the porch, and the steady, unwavering love of a man who had proven that true worth comes from the heart, not the mirror. The wedding reception was held at the ranch, with tables set up in the yard and lanterns strung between the trees. The whole community came to celebrate, bringing food and music and genuine joy for the couple. Margaret was amazed to see how many people considered Thomas a friend, how many had stories of his kindness and generosity. Old Pete played the fiddle, and when Thomas asked Margaret to dance, she found that despite his size, he moved with surprising grace and rhythm. The years that followed were everything Thomas had promised, and more. Margaret learned to love the rhythm of ranch life, the satisfaction of hard work, the deep contentment that came from building something lasting with someone you loved. She bore Thomas 4 children, each one inheriting his gentle nature and her fierce spirit. The ranch prospered under their joint care, becoming known throughout Wyoming, not just for its fine cattle, but for the hospitality and kindness of its owners. Their first child, a daughter they named Grace, arrived exactly 9 months after their wedding night. She had Thomas's kind eyes and Margaret's determined chin, and from the moment she drew her first breath, she had her father wrapped around her tiny finger. Thomas would spend hours rocking her to sleep, singing lullabies in his deep, gentle voice, and Margaret would watch from the doorway, marveling at the tenderness this big man showed to his tiny daughter. 2 years later came Thomas Jr., a sturdy boy who seemed destined to follow in his father's footsteps. Then came the twins, Mary and Sarah, named for Thomas's sisters, who brought chaos and joy in equal measure to the household. Each child was welcomed with the same overwhelming love, the same patient guidance, the same unwavering support that Thomas had shown to everyone who entered his life. Margaret established a school on the ranch, just as Thomas had dreamed, teaching not only their own children, but also the children of the ranch hands and neighboring families. She discovered that she had a gift for teaching, and the little schoolhouse that Thomas built for her became a center of learning and culture in their remote corner of Wyoming. She organized concerts and plays, started a lending library, and created a place where children could dream of futures beyond the limitations of frontier life. The ranch itself grew and prospered under their joint management. Margaret's education and business sense complemented Thomas's practical knowledge and natural leadership. They introduced new breeds of cattle, improved their breeding programs, and developed innovative methods of land management that other ranchers came to study and emulate. Their success was built not just on hard work, but on the trust and respect they showed to everyone who worked with them. Margaret often thought back to that first day, to the cruel words she had spoken in her ignorance and fear. She had come west, looking for security, and found love instead. She had expected to settle for a marriage of convenience and discovered a partnership that enriched every aspect of her life. Thomas had taught her that true strength comes not from physical power or social standing, but from the courage to be kind, the wisdom to see beyond surfaces, and the faith to believe in love, even when it comes in unexpected packages. The community around them flourished as well, partly due to their influence and example. Thomas served on the town council, helping to bring a railroad spur to Millbrook and establishing the first bank in the county. Margaret organized the Ladies' Auxiliary, which provided support for families in need and worked to improve conditions in the town. Together, they helped transform a rough frontier settlement into a thriving community where families could put down roots and build lasting legacies. As their children grew, Margaret and Thomas made sure to instill in them the values that had brought them together: the importance of looking beyond appearances, the power of kindness, the value of hard work, and the understanding that true love is built on respect, trust, and shared dreams. Their home became known throughout the territory as a place where travelers could find a warm meal and a safe bed, where young people could come for advice and guidance, where anyone in trouble could find help without judgment. On their 25th wedding anniversary, as they sat on that same porch where he had first shared his dreams with her, Margaret took Thomas's hand and spoke the words that had been in her heart for decades. "You know, my love, I used to think I was the one who traveled 1,000 miles to find you, but now I realize you're the one who traveled the furthest. You crossed the distance between my fear and my heart, and you made it look effortless." Thomas squeezed her hand and smiled, that same gentle smile that had won her over all those years ago. And Margaret knew that some journeys are worth every difficult step along the way. Their 4 children had grown into remarkable adults, each carrying forward the lessons their parents had taught them. Grace had become a teacher herself, opening a school for girls in Denver. Thomas Jr. had taken over much of the ranch operations, proving himself worthy of his father's legacy. The twins had married well and started families of their own, but they remained close to the ranch, bringing their children to visit their grandparents regularly. As they watched the sunset paint the sky in familiar shades of orange and pink, Margaret reflected on the unexpected turns that life had taken. She had boarded that stagecoach in Boston as a desperate woman with few options, and she had found instead a life richer and more fulfilling than anything she could have imagined. The man she had once dismissed as fat and pig-like had become the center of her universe, the foundation upon which she had built not just a family, but an entire community. Thomas, now in his 50s, had aged gracefully, his hair silver, but his eyes still holding that same kindness that had first caught her attention. His body bore the marks of decades of hard work, but he moved with the confidence of a man who had lived his life according to his principles and had no regrets. When he looked at Margaret, she could still see the wonder in his eyes, as if he couldn't quite believe his good fortune in winning her love. "Do you ever regret it?" Margaret asked quietly, watching their grandchildren play in the yard below. "Taking a chance on a bitter woman who said such terrible things to you?" Thomas was quiet for a long moment, considering her question with the same thoughtfulness he brought to all important matters. "Margaret," he said finally, "that woman on the stagecoach platform wasn't bitter. She was scared. She was protecting herself the only way she knew how. I saw past the words to the heart beneath, and I knew that if I could just be patient enough, kind enough, you would see what I saw, that we were meant to be together." As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Margaret leaned against Thomas's shoulder and felt the same sense of peace and contentment that had sustained her through 25 years of marriage. She had learned that love wasn't about finding someone perfect, but about finding someone who made you want to be the best version of yourself. Thomas had done that for her, and she hoped she had done the same for him. The ranch around them hummed with the quiet activity of evening, cattle settling for the night, horses nickering softly in the pasture, the distant sound of the ranch hands finishing their duties. It was a symphony of contentment, of lives well lived and dreams fulfilled. Margaret closed her eyes and listened to the heartbeat of the life they had built together, knowing that whatever challenges the future might bring, they would face them as they had faced everything else, together with love, patience, and the unshakable faith that had carried them through their first difficult days to this moment of perfect peace.